right, welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in wherever you may be listening from across the Aloha State. Here for part two of our discussion on interest rates. If you haven't listened to the first part, we released it the Monday before, and a lot of good stuff on checking and savings accounts and investing in the current interest rate environment. But this episode is going to talk a little more about loans, debt, and leveraging. Paul, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going pretty good. It's definitely a timely topic of interest rates,
Sure.
as they slowly creeped up over the last year or so.
Right,
Um,
right.
so yeah, just kind of jumping in here. As we mentioned in our first for our part one of this interest rate series, Fed fund rate, right? The Fed rate is currently at around 5.25 or 5.25%. Which if you compare that to historical averages, which is probably somewhere around 4%, it's not that far off, right?
Right.
And then just quickly stating that we had that July of 1981, they had that blip, if you will,
Mhm.
up to 19% as their interest rate. Could you imagine? No, that is just
Right. That is
crazy.
crazy.
It
Yep.
is. So with that, this episode or this specific talk will be about how interest rate affects our debt or our liabilities. So, Jason, where you want to start?
Yeah, I guess a good place to start would be kind of highlighting. Well, I think it's fun. We kind of talked through, we looked at some of the numbers of the different consumer debt
Right.
totals for the United States. And I think those are a good place to start. Do you want to run us down those numbers?
Sure, absolutely. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure this is just consumer debt, not national debt, right?
Yeah, I believe
So,
so. Right.
yeah, so this is separate from from our US government debt. This is
Right,
just
right, 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 right.
crazy to think about that. Um, So, consumer debt in America. So, what are some of those? So, there's mortgage debt. So, in America, there's over $12 trillion of mortgage debt, which, isn't too bad when you consider it's connected to real estate and, that could be expensive. But $12 trillion. HELOCs or home equity line of credits are about $349 billion, which is with a B. That's still a lot of money. Here's one that's kind of scary. Credit cards is just over $1 trillion, $1 trillion of credit card debt.
Right.
Scary.
It
Um,
is.
and then just finishing it off with auto loans, auto and student loans. So those are both separately, respectively, at $1.6 trillion each. So $1.6 in auto loans and 1.6 in student loans. So that's a lot of trillions and a lot of billions of
Mhm.
debt. So
Yeah, and consumer debt, it's not going down. All the trends point to it continuing to rise. I think we just got to be uh smart about using debt and leverage, right? I mean, it's a necessary evil in a lot of ways, right? I mean, you're going to take a mortgage, you got a HELOC to do some work on the house or whatever it might be. You need a good vehicle, but I think you just got to be smart about taking on that debt and make sure that you can afford it. The juice is worth the squeeze, so to speak. Make sure that it fits into your plan, because it is sad when you see a lot of people here in Hawaii and throughout the country who are just overloaded with this debt. Sometimes it's to their own fault, and sometimes it's no fault of their own. Circumstances happen, things happen, and you end up with this mountain of debt that you're trying to get out of.
right. And
uh,
it doesn't help that recently over the last, year or so, we have had inflationary environments. So things are just costing more to just
sure.
survive. So that doesn't help. And the compounding effect of that is, they have to hold a little bit more debt than maybe they did before. So yeah,
Right.
some of these things, we're not going to necessarily talk about types of debt, but some of these things are necessary, right? I mean, maybe you needed to go to school to get a better job, or you needed a mortgage to own that home. But really, in these rising interest rates environments, we're trying to talk about like how that might affect people, um, and what maybe to think about, right?
Right.
Um, so, for me, it's how can we maybe compare? We'll just talk about it quickly. If we have some savings, or we have maybe there's a savings account that is paying us maybe 5% interest, but we have some maybe credit card debt or some other debts that's upwards of maybe 20+% in some environments. How would we think about that, or how might someone want to think about that?
Sure. Yeah, and it's just if you're carrying these rising interest rate debts, you know, and maybe you're saving, you're putting money in other areas, it starts to become more and more apparent that, hey, I need to pay down this debt as this rises. So, one thing to think about is, let's say you're putting money into a high yield savings account earning 5% right now, but you're carrying a credit card balance that's, pushing you upwards to 20% on this balance you have. Well, it's at that point, it's you know a simple analytical decision that you need to stop putting money into this, high yield savings account, unless you really need it for emergency funds or some other reason, and you need to start paying down that debt. It's simple interest rate arbitrage. You know, what is the best use for this dollar? And that's something to consider. So we took some interest rates that we found online. So auto loans 4.75%, HELOC is hovering around 8.5%, 30-year mortgage is 7%. And
Yeah.
I like those last two, the HELOC and mortgages, because they really tie into the housing market, if you want to bring us into that.
Yeah, I mean, housing market definitely is being impacted. Maybe we haven't felt it yet, but I mean, obviously we don't have crystal balls here, but assuming that, or historically, right, when you have a rising interest rate environment, where we're where we are now, basically that's where we are, you see a pulling back of maybe prices or costs, or even transaction volume. So you would see that. Now it's interesting. Hawaii is a unique place, where I feel like it's pretty strong when it comes to pullbacks, right? It's very resilient when it comes to
Right.
pullbacks. Um, but that doesn't mean that the interest rate isn't impacting, um, borrowers, right? These payments are, double effectively in some cases because of the interest rates. From 2020 to now, interest
Right.
rates have pretty much doubled or more. um, so with that being said, there hasn't been a lot of that pullback, or a lot of that immediately, but we're more than likely going to start feeling it. And other parts of the country might feel it a little bit more first than Hawaii
Right.
specifically. I don't know. Any extra thoughts on that?
No, it just makes it difficult at a 7%, 30-year mortgage. You start looking at how much house can I afford, and it really changes the equation, uh, as opposed to being okay at a 2.5% interest rate on a 30-year mortgage. How much house can I afford?
Yeah.
It's a pretty significant difference when you're looking at putting down 20% and taking out a 30-year mortgage for a lot of first time home buyers. So yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, we'll see how Hawaii's housing market is very resilient, but I think we're gonna see houses stay on the market a little longer. But yeah, how Hawaii is, that'd be interesting for us to do, is get somebody who's really has a pulse on the real estate market on the show to kind of talk through and see how that's impacting things.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this episode isn't going to be for real estate specifically, but
Sure.
interest rates impact those types of things. And I have read a few different places that some things are being, if they're not as desirable, there are different circumstances that you know it's just not affordable, right? And,
Hmm.
if your mortgage is $10,000 a month, and it's only on $1 million, or something, something around there,
Right.
like that's a
Right.
lot of money for not a lot of value in a sense, right? But yeah, you're right. We should definitely talk a little bit more real estate locally here. Um, so now where would someone go, if they are considering, or how would refinancing look like today?
Well, there's a lot of considerations with that in that why are you refinancing? And going back to my cheesy cliche, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? I mean, it's got to be a good reason because, well, not necessarily. If you're refinancing and you already had an interest rate hovering around 5%, 2%, not a big deal. But there's some people who during the COVID times there, they locked in 30-year interest rate, 30-year mortgages at like 2.25%, 2.5%.
Yeah.
And that's something, I mean, you know, you really want to hold on to. That's cheap money that's being, lent to you. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of considerations when going into refinancing. I don't think we're going to see much of that now with the interest rates the way they are. I don't think we're going to see a lot of. I'd be surprised if the auto industry slows down a little bit too. For a while there, that was really hot and cars were flying off the shelf. But now with financing being more expensive, I think it's going to cause a little bit of a pause in purchases and some more consideration when it comes to auto purchasing.
No, I would agree there. And it doesn't help that there was already an inflationary environment for those types of things, right? Um, for just new cars, manufacturing being down because of all that stuff. So yeah,
And I would say, I would say too, we touched on this in part one. We don't know how long this interest rate environment lasts, right? So we saw is actually a pretty steep rise up to where we're at now, relatively, in the past year. It might hover around there for the next several years. It might continue to rise or it might go down. And it's really hard to time out the economics, if you're saying, well, I'll just wait and I think it's going to go down in a year, and then I'll get that 30-year mortgage. Well, we don't really know what those interest rates are going to look like. So it's hard to time it out like that.
No, 100%. And I would say with that, like, it's easy to assume that it will come down, but because of maybe some of our peers' recency of just like thinking of it always going to be below 3% or around 3%. But maybe really considering, like you said, making that squeeze a little bit tighter to try to get out of some of those high interest debts, right?
Right.
So that when those types of things happen, if they happen, you can be ready. Or if they don't happen, you're at least shedding that really high interest debts that just are really probably impacting people on a monthly basis with their budgets. So
Yeah, sure. So a lot of things to consider. Like I said in the last one, some food for thought, not giving any advice, but just keep an eye out. Those interest rates are usually always going to change. They're very rarely do they stay, steady and low like they did for the past decade. And yeah, just look at each one of your dollars. What is it? What's the goal? Be intentional and make smart decisions as it comes to, your goals and your finances.
perfect.
The opinions and statements presented on this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations. Never make any investment or financial decisions based on information offered on this show without first consulting your financial, legal, or tax advisor. All economic and performance information mentioned on the show is historical in nature and is not indicative of any future results. All indices mentioned on this show are unmanaged and cannot be invested in directly. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. Lastly, all opinions expressed by Jason Cutitta, Paul McWilliams, and any guests on the show are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of or are endorsed by ToBA Financial or Inspire Advisors. For Jason Cutitta, investment advisory services are offered through ToBA Financial LLC, a registered investment advisor offering advisory services in the state of Hawaii and in other jurisdictions where exempt from registration. And for Paul McWilliams, investment advisory services are offered through Inspire Advisors LLC, a registered investment advisor with the SEC.